from Kansas State University. This is Agriculture Today. Eric Atkinson here. Here's what's coming up. K-State's Dan O'Brien will discuss what it'll take to shake the soybean market out of its bearish state, what market signals are suggesting about 2019 corn acreage in the U.S., and whether wheat prices have now stalled out for an extended time during Dan's weekly segment on the grain market trends. Also today, K-State's Romulo Lollato will recommend to you wheat producers a step-by-step process for selecting winter wheat varieties for planting this fall. Among other things, Romulo will play up the idea of selecting varieties with different maturity ratings to spread one's production risk. Further ahead on Kansas agricultural weather, K-State's Mary Knapp, right here on Agriculture Today.
Hamburgers, roast, ribs, steak, or whatever you prefer. Beef, it's what's for dinner. Kansas cattle farmers produce 7.5 million head of cattle per year. It takes about 7 tablespoons of peanut butter to get the same amount of protein in 1 serving of lean beef. Support your local Kansas farmers and ranchers. Eat beef. This message was brought to you by the K-State Animal Sciences Leadership Academy participants.
You're listening to the K-State Radio Network and Agriculture Today. Good to have you aboard once again. What's happening on the grain market scene? Our first order of business, as alongside now, is Dan O'Brien, grain market economist with K-State Research and Extension. Again this week, we're happy to be visiting with Dan in person about these market trends. And we see, Dan, as we look at the feed grain market's late summer weakness. That may be, you say, typical, but is it a shade toward the out of the ordinary side this time around?
When you look at the last 3 calendar years, 2015, 16, and 17, we had markets that were focused on crop production prospects, assessing the risks of a potential short crop, with the focus on what could happen coming out of the August crop report when fears of what could fall apart didn't fall apart in terms of production. Then you saw, basically drops to calendar year lows in those years. So what we have here is, for those that are sellers that are looking for higher prices, it's probably a discouraging situation, but not unexpected. And I think we need to keep in mind the other side of this too. These lower prices are buying opportunities if there's any grain available to be bought. Mm-hmm. Again, how much, given the experiences of what we've had, expectations, hope for higher prices, when you see a drop-off like this, you have to ask how many sellers will there be, and how many bushels available at that time. We do have expectations on the feed grain side of pretty good ethanol production usage. And we see a buildup of stocks right now, but the U.S. economy, absent a real correction of with inflation or something that would derail it, still looking like there's pretty strong movement. You do see the stock market holding up well. We have seen some weakness in oil and gasoline prices over the last downtrends over the last 2 or 3 months, but not catastrophic compared to where we were at even a year ago. Again, we're looking at more like around $2, et cetera, as opposed to $1.46 for gasoline futures. And we see still at the ethanol plants pretty strong basis levels. Now, the futures have gone up and down, but basis levels 25 over September for both corn and grain sorghum, dead even. 377.5 on yesterday's prices for the top end of the price range. In fact, in Kansas for ethanol plants, bids for the U.S. Daily Ethanol Report shown at 347.5 to 377.5 for corn and 352.5 to 377.5 for grain sorghum. Of course, you may have a situation where you have bids all over the state for corn and maybe just a few places for grain sorghum. So you'd have to kind of keep that in mind. But all that said, still you see some strength in demand, or at least underlying strength in demand for these crops. If we have ethanol demand holding moderately steady, and again, projections of 5.625 billion bushels used next year, new record high. Feed usage projected to not fall out of bed, to hold up decently as well with livestock numbers. Again, my colleague Glenn Tonser can talk about that better than I can, but generally not looking at a tremendous shortfall in livestock numbers and the need for feed. Wet corn milling holding up decently as we're looking at the products coming out of that process. Even exports with short crop here out of Brazil for their second crop corn numbers being lower. You do see some likelihood of demand holding up. This past week for corn, we had export shipments of about just under 52 million bushels. You do see some forward sales off into the next marketing year. We basically have 2 weeks left in this marketing year to get to the end of August. So export numbers look decent. And I guess this pace of usage will meet the number for exports that the USDA had put up in June, July, or earlier. They raised that number here in the July report, and so it probably falls short of the newest raised number, but still pretty strong exports for corn. So it is as it is. For feed grains, it really does look like we've seen a continuation of the tariff impact on U.S. and Kansas by default. Grain sorghum export movement. Just haven't seen many new cash sales since those tariffs were instituted. However, there's another side to this. If exports were all that were happening for grain sorghum, then we'd see the basis absolutely collapse. When you look in western Kansas and central Kansas, basically you see a fairly historic relationship. We already said the ethanol plants they're even money for corn and grain sorghum. You look in western Kansas, you're about 20 cents down, it looks like, or less with regard to basis levels for grain sorghum, and central Kansas about the same. So grain sorghum is apparently finding a use off in these other domestic uses, ethanol plant usage, feed usage, etc. I think the most judicious thing to say is that guys should be really welcome to see grain sorghum exports out of the U.S. rekindle, restart, and move forward, because right now buyers must be going on a hand-to-mouth basis. There's just not a lot of buying off into that next marketing year that's happened yet.
Broadly speaking, Dan, the markets are still paying a fair amount of attention to the production issues.
Oh, yes.
But at some point, that shift has to happen, so more attention is paid to demand and therefore potentially lending a little more strength to these markets.
Yes, we have certainly had years within the past 2 or 3, 4 years where we've been focused on production issues, and then had large crops come, the markets fall down fairly low. In response to that, a lot of times it's happening after, again, in August, after the August crop report. And it turns out in hindsight they'd fallen low enough that they weren't accounting for the strength in demand that followed thereafter. And you just see the patterns. As we came out of those late summer lows, we've moved sideways to higher as we moved on. South America is going to be planting some of their crops here in November, December, thereabouts, and an open question, with regard to what they'll do for corn and soybeans. I don't see any disincentive for them to plant soybeans right now. And if they do that, if they pull acres from corn in Argentina and Brazil, again, you got first and second planting in Brazil. But to the degree they go full bore on the soybean side, I guess the strength of U.S. domestic demand plus signals coming out of Brazil, absent any crop issues, you can see factors out there that could be supportive for feed grain markets going down the road.
Speaking of soybeans, here's a market that is definitively in a slump. How much of this has to do directly with the Chinese tariff situation?
And the psychology of the market, a lot. And, we have some decent export movement here. Last 1 or 2 weeks of the old crop marketing year, we have 23 million bushels of soybean shipments for the week ending August the 16th. And on a number of years, we're looking at 2 and 3 million bushels and hoping we just get something happening. Well, so here we've had 23 million bushels. We have a pace. For this marketing year, we've shipped a little bit over 2 billion. Historically, that's a pretty good year for exports. And China, of course, has stepped back, at least from direct purchases. Other countries have stepped in, et cetera. Projections for that next marketing year are for about 2.060 billion bushels. So not forecasting a a washout in the coming marketing year for soybean exports either. Really, the bigger questions that all this has raised has been what will a country like China do? Here, their projections now for their soybean usage for the coming year are down about 10 million metric tons, from 105 to about 95. That's their projection. Are they really going to do that? And to make that happen, you're trying to substitute in other oilseeds. You're cutting back domestic consumption, et cetera. So I think the markets right now are factoring in that type of a situation. And here on yesterday's close, September soybeans closed at 842, and that would be the lowest since we got down to about 779 back in late 2008 off into 2009. The lowest we had been was 844.5, and that was in early 2016. So on yesterday's close, to be down below historic lows is a thought-provoking deal. At this point, and until there's some new change in this and no short crop really happening, psychology is pretty negative. It's hard to see them doing anything else but that right now.
The wheat market will close out on that. This trade has flattened out some and maybe has lost a tad of its steam. Is that a fair assessment?
Yeah. When you look at where we were mid-June at about 470, and the highs we had late July, early August, about $6, and closed yesterday at 527. We're dead in the middle of that range, dead in the middle of it. We did see weekly export shipments of U.S. wheat at almost 17 million bushels, and that's is that gangbusters? No, but it's better than 10 to 12. And I think the number for us to watch, Eric, each week as we talk about this is the total shipments and new sales for wheat that you have going forward. Right now, we have new sales of about 314, 315 million bushels. It's 31% of the USDA's projection. So right now there's about a 10% gap. That'll be a signal to watch that, gosh, maybe we are seeing buyers actually come to our shores and start to buy wheat.
Well, we'll make a note to monitor that on a regular basis in the coming weeks. As always, Dan, thanks for the update.
Thanks, Eric. Take care.
He's a grain market economist. K-State Research and Extension is Dan O'Brien. We'll return shortly with more on this Agriculture Today.
What is radon? Home exposure to radon gas is the leading cause of lung cancer death in the United States for non-smokers. In Kansas, 1 in 4 homes will test at or above the EPA action level. The Surgeon General recommends all homes be tested and fixed if necessary. Visit kansasradonprogram.org for more information. Test, fix, save a life. This message brought to you by the Kansas Radon Program, the Kansas Association of Broadcasters, and this station.
Agriculture Today continues now. Winter wheat seeding time in Kansas, just right around the corner. And you producers ought to be firming up your decisions on variety selections, and we want to contribute some thoughts toward that objective now with our guest. Romulo Lollato is back with us. He's a wheat production specialist, K-State Research and Extension, on factors to consider when choosing a wheat variety for the 2018-19 cropping season. And we're coming off of a year, Romulo, where wheat production was spotty and very much rain-dependent. So what did we learn about wheat variety selection from this past year's experience?
Well, Eric, I think you make a good point there as far as the drought that we had and the variability in yields. Now, of course, that's not good for our agriculture, but when we think about variety selection and not only that, variety development, even thinking about the breeding programs behind, we need to think that those very harsh conditions, they get imprinted in those varieties. So if they make it through this year, right, especially in the breeding program, if we have good lines that make well through this year, well, there's a pretty good chance that they will be able to repeat the performance here in next years as well if we have that drought again. So definitely this year we saw a lot of variability. We saw varieties that are typically grown out in western Kansas or even Colorado perform extremely well in central Kansas. Now, that's why it is very important for us, whenever selecting wheat variety, never to look at only 1 year of data and never look at only one location of data either. always make sure that you have in mind the last 3, perhaps even 4 years, and how those varieties have been performing in these last few years. If we think of all the variability that we had in the last few years, 2014, 15, 16, 17, and 18, right? If a variety has been at least consistent across all of those years, it's a very good indication of some stability on that variety.
And that leads us to a series of steps that you list that producers can go through in arriving at the variety or varieties that will best suit their growing conditions, their operations. And in sifting all of that down, you say one should select, for starters, several varieties that might be suitable.
Yeah, so I think today producers have several resources that can help guide them through that variety selection process. But in the end, what is that we're looking for? Yield. Right? That's our final product. Varieties are bred with different regional adaptabilities, and some of them will perform excellent in central Kansas, perhaps the ones that have a better acid soil tolerance, medium to medium early maturity, good straw strength, might have a pretty good performance in central, south central Kansas. As we go to western Kansas, we're actually looking at other things like drought tolerance and perhaps even a taller variety, because producers are looking for residue as well. So there are different agronomic traits that lead to those varieties being successful as far as yield goes. And K-State puts that information out by year and by location. Select the nearest location to you and look at the average of the last 3 or 4 years for that location. And even better, for more than one location, if you are near 2 or 3 different K-State variety performance tests, definitely take advantage of that. Now, within yield record, when we do head-to-head comparisons between varieties for a given growing region and for several years. So let's say, for example, that we get South Central Kansas and we do 12 to 15 different location years as comparison, right? And I was just doing this exercise for our pre-plant school in Sumner County and McPherson this last week. And really showed up that within K-State trials, the 2 varieties, Larry and WB4303, had the same yield and were the top yielding varieties over these 15 trials. Now, that does not mean that you only have these 2 options. Although they were the highest yielding, when you do a statistical comparison of those varieties, you end up with a list of about 10 varieties that maybe there are half a bushel here less, half a bushel there more, so they're actually statistically the same as those best yielding varieties. So just looking at that long-term regional yield record, you already have now 8 or 10 options that they all have very similar yield potential historically in that region. And then you also have the ones that have not been performing as well. Mm-hmm. So, for example, T158 was one that was not performing as well as Larry or 4303. We also had Winterhawk and even WB Cedar, which a lot of producers use. They were not performing as well as some of these other top-yielding varieties.
In that region, South Central Kansas.
Exactly. That's just the example for South Central Kansas. I'm sure that this classification would be different for Southwest Kansas, for example. That's why it's important for us to look at regional and several years. So after doing that overview, now we have a list of several varieties that are actually performing similarly, right, for that region. So you need to start looking at what are the agronomic attributes that you need in your operation. Do you need drought tolerance? Is that your number one concern? Or do you need wheat streak mosaic resistance? Is that your number one concern? Perhaps you're not willing to use a foliar fungicide, and so resistance to stripe rust and leaf rust becomes your number one concern. You're planting after corn, and in that case, you're actually looking for head scab tolerance, so that becomes your number one concern. So I guess look at your cropping system. What is the rotation that you're going after? Are you going after soybeans? In that case, you need to select varieties that can tiller well late in the fall and into the spring as well and produce yield from those spring tillers. So really take into consideration your previous crop. If it is corn, you're looking for head scab tolerance. You have a much shorter list of available varieties. But nowadays, historically, we have had only Everest as a good option following corn. And nowadays, we actually can think of at least 4 or 5 varieties that have a good scab tolerance as well. That might be a good replacement for Everest in those acres following corn. You're looking for straw strength, for example. You have a high fertility program, and you typically are working with high rates of nitrogen or irrigated systems. You definitely need to be looking at varieties of straw strength. So what are the agronomic traits that are top in your list? So again, we start with that yield record. Within those 10 varieties that you have, what are the ones that match the criteria that you're looking for in your operation, right? Do you need head scab? Okay, well, WB4269, Zenda, Everest are all very good options. Even Bob Dole would be a good option. So really the second step after yield record is really looking at those agronomic attributes of the varieties that have shown up towards the top of that list.
And so at that point, you likely have narrowed it down to maybe 2 or 3 varieties. I want to mention one more trait here, and that is the maturity rating of that given variety. How much weight should producers give to that, and is that a good tool for spreading one's crop risk?
That's an excellent point, Eric. Thanks for bringing it up. And definitely, I always advocate for producers to plant 2 or 3 varieties at least, and always spreading their risk through maturity. Actually, if we think of an early maturing variety, let's get a couple examples, WB Cedar, Everest, or even SY Llano, some varieties that are really early maturing, earlier than anything else, or any of the other options that we have on the market. Those varieties, they will be more exposed to potential risks of freeze damage. So, for example, if they come out early in the spring, they come out of dormancy early, and mid-March, our temperatures go back to 20 degrees, they actually might get hurt by those freezing temperatures that early. And they're also going to head much earlier, so if they head late April or even mid to late April, well, there's a chance that we have freeze potential in Kansas all the way to May. So they would be more exposed to those freezing conditions. On the other hand, those early maturing varieties, they will be more likely to escape heat stress late in the season. Those varieties are probably going to be towards the late phase of grain filling already, and so they're not going to get hurt as much. Later maturing varieties, they are the exact opposite, right? They're going to be more protected from freeze damage because they're going to be later coming out of the winter and winter dormancy, but they will be more likely exposed to heat stress later in the season if conditions become hot in the summer, which in Kansas
it highly likely.
So it's important to spread your risk through different maturities, having part of your acres planted to perhaps a medium early maturing variety, part of the acres also planted to a medium late. There are regions in the state where I concern about planting a late maturing wheat. For example, South Central Kansas, I am concerned planting a variety as late as LCS Chrome, for example, which is an excellent variety in Northwest Kansas, for example. So I think we need to work with a range of maturities that spreads our risk, but it doesn't really put us in greater risk of something like getting a variety that is too late in a region that benefits typically from earlier varieties.
One more thing to note, you are on the circuit. The series of pre-plant wheat schools that K-State Research and Extension sponsors throughout the state, some have already taken place, many, many more ahead in the next couple of 3 weeks or so. And, of course, you're attending those, providing similar information, and would invite producers to be there for those, right?
Definitely. Producers are more than welcome to join us. Contact your county extension office and see which one is the nearest pre-plant meeting going on nearest to you, because that gives you the opportunity not only to listen to the most recent research update that K-State has on wheat production, but also gives you the chance to ask any questions that you might have. Many times the discussion that comes in those meetings is the best part of the meeting. Producers bringing up their concerns, and we working with them to try and find solutions.
There's great value in that interaction, so do take full advantage of the pre-plant wheat school nearest you. And Romulo, as always, thanks for the input.
Thank you very much, Eric.
Some considerations on selecting a wheat variety for planting this fall in Kansas. Romulo Lollato is a wheat production specialist with K-State Research and Extension. You're listening to the K-State Radio Network.
While many people know hunger is an issue in developing countries, it is also a problem in our own backyards. In 2010, 1 in 7 Kansans struggled to put adequate food on the table. 2 K-State Research and Extension programs are tackling this problem. The Family Nutrition Program and Expanded Food and Nutrition Education Program reach thousands of Kansans in more than 70 counties. They learn how to eat healthy with a low budget. For more information about these programs, visit ksre.ksu.edu.
Broadcasting from the campus of Kansas State University, this is Agriculture Today. Eric Atkinson here. In the agricultural news headlines today, a local item of great significance. Officials from the U.S. Agency for International Development announced yesterday that they've awarded $21.9 million to Kansas State University to continue funding 3 research laboratories that work to end global hunger and poverty. Back in 2013, USAID awarded 3 innovation labs to K-State through the Feed to Future initiative, which is the U.S. government's effort to end global hunger. K-State initially won those awards through a competitive process against programs across the United States. Now, according to the acting director for USAID's Bureau for Food Security, Vern Long, these awards don't happen by accident, saying that they have a very high bar for extending programs, as she put it, and saying that it's really a reflection of the innovative approach that these programs have taken and how they bring the best of U.S. science to bear on those global challenges.
This kind of research extension really affords the opportunity of the researchers to take it to the next level. When we consider applicants for an extension of their award, it's a very high bar. We look at both the performance and the strategic direction of the technical area they're working in, as well as their actual vision for what that could be. And so we're really proud to announce that 3 of these labs here at K-State are in a good position to move forward with their work. The Sorghum and Millet Innovation Lab will be continuing its work across East and West Africa and Haiti. The Applied Wheat Genomics program, which works across South Asia, bringing wheat genomics technologies and precision breeding approaches to wheat breeding. And the post-harvest loss reduction program will be continuing its work in a number of countries throughout the Feed the Future initiative.
Each of those projects had an initial 5-year award. USAID is now adding $14 million over 5 years to the sorghum millet program, $3 million over 3 years to the post-harvest loss initiative, and $4.9 million for 5 years to wheat genomics. In 2014, K-State was also awarded $32 million for the Feed to Future Innovation Lab for collaborative research on sustainable intensification, and that project could be considered for renewal next year. We'll be visiting more with the USAID's Vern Long about the renewed funding for these Feed the Future Innovation Laboratories at K-State right here on the broadcast next week. The expected release today of details of the trade tariff farmer aid package has been pushed back to Monday, according to USDA Secretary Sonny Perdue. The rule covering USDA plans to make the aid payments and take other actions to help farmers impacted by trade actions is still under review at the Office of Management and Budget. As for the specific amounts of aid, Perdue would not comment on reports that the payments to soybean producers would be $1.65 per bushel and 1 cent per bushel for corn. The Secretary said that we will acknowledge that dairy and pork and soybeans will be the commodities that are more dramatically affected by the tariffs, in his words. He added, quoting again, "It's not going to make everybody whole. It's not going to make everybody happy. It's not going to seem like it's equitable." And Chinese leader Xi Jinping and his trade officials are not budging after 2 days of trade policy talks that ended yesterday in Washington. A Trump administration official acknowledged that the president and his team have repeatedly laid out for Chinese officials the changes in behavior they'd like to see, but so far, said that official, they've yet to see those. Negotiators made no real progress at the 2-day meeting, although Beijing described the talks as constructive and frank and said the two sides would stay in contact about the next steps. Meantime, a fresh round of U.S. tariffs on $16 billion of Chinese imports went into effect yesterday, Beijing retaliating with tariffs of $16 billion on American imports. Last year, wheat streak mosaic virus ravaged a large part of the Kansas wheat crop, especially in western Kansas. This year, the disease far less prevalent. That doesn't mean that you producers should let your guard down. Marcia Boswell talks about that on this week's Kansas Wheat Scoop. Marcia?
On average, wheat streak mosaic virus causes $75 million in losses to Kansas wheat farmers every year. Wheat streak mosaic can cause a yield loss of more than 80%. Wheat streak mosaic virus isn't treatable, but it is preventable. If we take preventative measures now, future yields will improve exponentially. The virus is spread by the wheat curl mite, which feeds on wheat and other grasses. Wheat curl mites and the virus must have a green host tissue to survive on throughout the summer after harvest. They most commonly reside on volunteer wheat that blew out the back of the combine or shattered grain from hailstorms that happened before harvest. The mites on the fallen kernels move to the sprouting volunteer seedlings as new plants emerge in the summer. Volunteer wheat is considered a green bridge because it allows the wheat curl mites and the virus to survive the summer. Losses due to wheat streak mosaic virus depend on variety, weather, percentage of infected plants, and the time of infection. The first visible symptoms usually pop up in April on the edges of fields near volunteer wheat. Yellow streaking and mosaic patterns on young leaves and stunted tillers are some of the first signs. Symptoms worsen as the weather warms. The best way to prevent the spread of wheat streak mosaic virus is to remove volunteer wheat and other grassy weeds. Volunteer wheat must be completely dead and dry for 2 weeks before planting a new wheat crop. Volunteer wheat and other grassy weeds can be killed with herbicides or tillage. A second management practice to limit the spread of the virus is to avoid early planting. Plant wheat after the Hessian fly-free date for your area. In some areas in western Kansas where there is no Hessian fly-free date, farmers should choose to wait until late September or October to plant their wheat. Planting after these dates will reduce the risk for the new wheat crop and reduce wheat curl mites from moving to new locations of wheat. In addition, there are a few wheat varieties with moderate resistance to this devastating disease. Hard white wheats Joe and Clara CL, as well as hard red winter wheat Oakley CL, have performed well in areas with wheat streak mosaic. This resistance is not perfect, and these plants may still be susceptible to triticum mosaic or high plains mosaic viruses. The resistance to wheat streak mosaic is less effective at temperatures above 75 degrees Fahrenheit. Therefore, planting these varieties early for grazing can place fields at risk for disease-related yield losses. Undoubtedly, the best method to control wheat streak mosaic virus is controlling volunteer wheat. Be a good steward and a good neighbor when making management decisions, and you might just be rewarded with a boost in bushels on your next wheat crop. For Kansas Wheat, I'm Marcia Boswell.
Many thanks, Marcia. Well, ahead, our weekly summary and outlook on Kansas agricultural weather. Standing by, K-State's Mary Knapp for that. This is Agriculture Today. Legal and financial concerns surround the day-to-day management of the agricultural industry. Producers, ag creditors, and USDA agencies rely on Kansas Agricultural Mediation Services. If you've received an adverse decision from the USDA or have an ag credit concern, call today, 800-321-3276, or visit us online, Kansas Agricultural Mediation Services, exploring options, generating solutions. This Agriculture Today closes out on the Kansas Agricultural Weather Update. With us once again from the Weather Data Library here at K-State, Research and Extension climatologist Mary Knapp. As we were going into the weekend last week, Mary, it was thought that a widespread rain event would in fact soak up a pretty fair part, if not all, of the state of Kansas. And that basically materialized.
Right. If we look on a divisional basis, every division was wetter than normal, which has not been the case for most of the summer. The real winner in the water sweepstakes, if you want to call it that, was the southeast. They averaged over 3 inches, just a shade under 4 inches for the week, and that was about 5 times their normal precipitation for the period. So with that much rain, not surprisingly, there were some flooding issues and some problems, but basically greatly improved the drought situation in that part of the state. The Northwest was on the short end of the stick. They averaged 78/100ths of an inch. That was about 1 1/4 times their normal for the week and a surplus of about 18/100ths of an inch. The Northwest has seen more even rains throughout the summer, and so they've been drought-free for most of the summer and are, in fact, doing fairly well. The rest of the divisions basically run in between those amounts. The East Central and Northeast did see some significant rains. The Northeast averaged 1.77 inches, and the East Central averaged 2.07. What's probably most noteworthy with those areas is that these were areas that were not only in extreme drought, but in exceptional drought. We've seen some improvement in the drought monitor in that area, reducing the coverage of the exceptional drought, which is the absolute worst conditions that you can possibly get. But with that rain, we have not seen a large amount of runoff. Most of the cases it was
sopped up quickly.
Yeah, it was a all-day event, soaked into the soils, but did very little to produce runoff. What it will do is having moistened those soils would mean that the next round of rains have a better chance of actually producing some runoff.
And again, there are still limited pockets of that exceptional drought around, right?
Oh, yes. There are mostly in the eastern edges of that region where they saw less. They did not get the 2 to 3 inches. They were in the 1 to 2 inch range. Mm-hmm. So, yes, there are still areas of exceptional drought still out there. Again, reduced areas, but still present.
It was a cool week by normal standards, right?
Oh, yes, by just about any standards that you might want to play. Northwest was the coldest. They averaged 69 degrees for the week, and that was the average, not the average low or anything else, which is about 5.5 degrees cooler than normal for them. And they are typically our cooler part of the state. The Southeast averaged 75 degrees for the week, and that was 3.5 degrees cooler than normal. Statewide, we averaged 73 and 4 degrees, just a shade over 4 degrees cooler than we would normally expect. We did not have any 100-degree readings, but we did see a 96 down in Elkhart on the 17th. On the cold side of things, we got down to 45 at 2 locations in northwest Kansas, in Wallace and at Brewster. So again, still a wide range in temperatures, but we're moving more towards that cooler side of the scale.
But our brief brush with these more, fall-like temperatures is going to be short-lived. For the forecast tell us a warm-up is imminent.
Right. We are looking at, in the immediate, for the weekend, we're going to be back into the 90s. In fact, we'll probably hit the 90s today. It's also noteworthy in the eastern parts of the state that those humidity levels, dew point temperatures are up. So our nighttime lows are also going to stay elevated. We're likely to stay in the 70s for the nighttime, which, again, as we've noted in the past, can be problematic for people and livestock in particular. Also will increase some of the disease risks that we might have to look at on our crops that are still out in the field. The extended outlook for the 6 to 10 and the 8 to 14 is also for above normal temperatures. Keep in mind, as we move into the end of August and the first part of September, our normal highs tend to be going down. So normal high in Manhattan at this time is 90. If we hit 92, 93, we're going to be above normal. Our normal low is 60. So having those lows up in the 70s is going to really tilt our average temperature to the warm side. Unfortunately, or fortunately, depending upon what you're trying to get done, these warm temperatures are likely to be accompanied by drier than average weather. If you're in the southeast where you've got water ponding in the fields, a period of dry weather will be welcome. If you're in east central where you're still trying to refill stock ponds, this dry weather isn't going to be as much of a welcome pattern. The warmer temperatures, for the most part, will be welcome. That will give chances for the sorghum and the soybeans to progress more rapidly. as we approach the end of the season.
That is the upside to help particularly the sorghum along, as it needs that heat to finish off in good fashion here going into the fall. And in fact, in the upcoming E-Update newsletter out of the Department of Agronomy later today, there'll be an article on the impact of the colder temperatures you spoke of on flowering of grain sorghum.
Right. The biggest risks to the grain sorghum will be for those plants that were in flowering when we got these cool temperatures. That can cause some sterility in the head. So producers will want to evaluate where their crop was at that time. Those cold temperatures also will slow progress and can have a negative effect on the fill, depending again about how cold it is and how quickly temperatures warm back up and get that plant producing again.
Mm-hmm. So have a look at that, grain sorghum growers, at agronomy.ksu.edu, coming out later today. As always, Mary, we appreciate the report. Thanks for coming over.
Thanks, Eric.
Mary Knapp with us, climatologist with K-State Research and Extension, once more joining us from the Weather Data Library here at the university. And that is our time for today and for the week. Thanks to you for being along with us likewise, and do enjoy your weekend. Eric Atkinson here for Agriculture Today over the K-State Radio Network.